Hello, hello. I have been getting a lot of questions about polyvagal theory and breathwork. Now, if you know me, you probably know that I do facilitate a breathwork facilitator training and also a meditation teacher training. And in both of those programs, we touch on the importance of polyvagal theory. And so I'm going to dive right into that and get into the good, juicy stuff, and then also talk a little bit about how breathwork can be so potent in accessing the vagus nerve and really how that kind of works together with polyvagal theory. So, polyvagal theory is a term that was coined by Dr. Stephen Porges in 1994. And he coined this term as a way to really describe the many associations between the vagus nerve and emotional regulation, social connection, and also our fear response. So, the vagus nerve is our 10th cranial nerve. It is a really, really long nerve. It innervates the medulla and then kind of goes through the body. It's called the wandering nerve, and innervates all of the organs in the body all the way down to the gut. So it really is such an important part of the nervous system, and very likely why you've been hearing more and more about it. And so when we are looking at explaining and understanding this concept of polyvagal theory, it really is this kind of complex idea of many. So the term poly means many. So polyvagal is, many different components to this nervous system. So traditionally, the vagus nerve and the autonomic nervous system was understood as having two components, and that was a sympathetic regulation component and a parasympathetic regulation component. So the sympathetic regulation was all about fight, flight, or freeze. And the parasympathetic was rest and digest. So a lot of research and talk around stress was all focused on getting us out of the sympathetic nervous system and back into the parasympathetic nervous system, or that rest and digest experience within the body and the nervous system. Now, that understanding and explanation is not quite complete. So while there are these two components of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, the parasympathetic is actually divided up into two components. So the oldest component of the parasympathetic nervous system is the dorsal vagal complex. And this is actually located quite low in terms of the vagus nerve and innervates kind of more of the gut and the lower organs there. The newer component of the parasympathetic component to the autonomic nervous system is the ventral vagal complex, and that actually innervates up much higher, so above the heart, and it affects facial expressions and also feelings in the throat and even into the chest. So this is all related. So the upper component, the ventral vagal complex, is all related to our social nervous system. And so when we enter that space of the parasympathetic, that's really what we mean by that rest and digest. And it allows us to connect with other humans. It's really what helps us to be social beings. And so if you think about the evolution of our nervous system. So we started with the oldest component, the dorsal vagal complex, which actually is very protective in nature. So when we're in that space, we're in more of a shutdown or a disassociation. And so that's really what we use to describe as a component of the sympathetic nervous system, which is that freeze state. But truthfully, it's actually part of the parasympathetic. So that is the oldest part of the nervous system. And then we developed this fight or flight response in the sympathetic nervous system. So that's kind of more innervating, the middle component of the vagus nerve. And then we've got the ventral vagal complex as part of the parasympathetic nervous system. And that is social. So social is really, what we've developed most recently as humans. Now, something that's really fascinating about understanding this polyvagal theory is that when we go into stress response, so when we go into that sympathetic nervous system, we enter a space of fight or flight. But what happens if we can't fight or we can't leave? What if we are either too young or we just don't have the resources or the ability to leave the situation? And sometimes that can be self-made as well. Oftentimes it's really outside sources that are creating that. But sometimes we actually train ourselves not to change circumstances, not to leave a situation that feels uncomfortable. And we can kind of keep ourselves in a thought loop. So what ends up happening is we move into that disassociative state. So when the fight or flight doesn't work, we move into that dorsal vagal complex and into the space of disassociation. And at the ultimate, expression of that, we actually move into a space of near death or even into death. And so the whole point of that is actually to protect us, to move us into a state that is really low energy, because if we can't fight, we can't leave, what are we going to do? Well, we go into shutdown. So imagine, this is how I think about it a lot, is imagine a cat who's gone into labor. And so there's a lot of sympathetic activity, right? Because we're preparing the body to give birth. If they are startled or they don't feel safe, their body actually goes into a self-preservation mode. So they actually start to go into that space of freeze. Now, they don't have the same nervous system as us, but it's a good way to understand the protective mechanism of that. It is actually really helpful for us to move into that state if we can't really modulate that fight or flight response. An important thing to note about the parasympathetic nervous system, so those two components, the dorsal vagal complex and the ventral vagal complex, is really which organs it innervates. So the dorsal vagal complex, that's that lower, that that older component of the nervous system, it innervates the lower organs. So the liver, the kidneys, the intestines, the spleen, the stomach, and the sexual organs as well. And so when we move into that freeze state, those organs shut down. and really that's kind of more of a less accessible component of the nervous system in terms of some of the things that we're going to talk about with breathwork. Now, the ventral vagal complex, so the more evolved component of the parasympathetic nervous system, it innervates everything from the diaphragm up. And so this is really going to be the key here, because when we access the diaphragm through breathing, we positively affect that vagus nerve. We tone the vagus nerve and positively affect all of these organs above the diaphragm. So it innervates the diaphragm, the heart, the lungs, the inner ear, and also the facial muscles around your mouth and your ears. So this comes into play in really interesting ways as a component of how we interrelate, so how we connect with others, how we build relationships. So if we are in a safe space, if we are feeling like we're in that rest and digest nervous system, the muscles in our face are relaxed. So we're able to more easily smile, our eyes are soft, and the way that we relate to others is through those muscles, is really our facial expression. So as somebody watches our facial expressions change, it's really obvious, even if it's subconscious, that we are in an open and receptive space. Now, it also affects our vocal tone. So if we are in that relaxed state, we have a softer voice. So it's a little bit deeper and it's a little bit softer. So there isn't a lot of aggression in terms of the voice. So all of these things are really social cues that we are in an open and receptive space for connection. Now, if we move into the sympathetic nervous system or into that dorsal vagal complex, so that shutdown or that disassociation, the facial muscles absolutely cannot indicate that sense of calm. So we could try, have you ever tried that when you're feeling just not well, or like you can't connect, or you're in high anxiety? Have you tried to smile? Does it work? No, it does not work. And it feels like there's a lot of strain in the face. So it's difficult for us to connect when we are in those spaces of either fight, flight, or freeze. So a lot of the ways that we need to move into more of a connective space are all around this ability to shift back into that upper parasympathetic nervous system, so that ventral vagal complex. The ventral vagal complex, so that upper component of the parasympathetic nervous system, is all about safety and connection. It acts as a vagal brake. So it actually helps to regulate our physiological state, our emotional state, to that of more calm and connection. So it operates almost like a brake. So if there's a lot going on in terms of stress, so we're either in that fight, flight, or freeze response, if we can activate even a little bit that ventral vagal complex, we can help to modulate the stress response. So we can actually tone down the activity within the sympathetic nervous system and that lower parasympathetic nervous system, which is all about disassociation. So it helps us to kind of modulate that, so to calm that down, and then also to bring us into a greater space of connectivity, of safety and social engagement. All right, let us get into breath work and how breath work is such a powerful tool for modulating this nervous system, so this autonomic nervous system, and helping us to really access that vagal brake that I just spoke about, and help us to move back into that space of safety and ultimately social receptivity. So as I mentioned, that ventral vagal complex innervates the organs from the diaphragm up. And one of the very important aspects of breath work is that we stimulate the nervous system from the diaphragm up. So when we breathe deeply into the belly, through the nose specifically, we actually expand the belly, and with that, we tone and work the diaphragm. So when we inhale through our nose and fill our belly, so try that right now. You can place your hands on your belly and start to breathe in through your nose, filling your belly like a balloon. You can feel that there's some activity in your solar plexus, and your solar plexus is where your diaphragm is. And that will actually help to move the diaphragm down. So the diaphragm is a domed shape muscle in the center of your body. It kind of separates your organs from your heart and your lungs up, and then your organs below. So this dome shaped muscle, when you inhale, it comes down. It actually pulls down. And so when your belly expands, it really helps that action. And more air, more oxygen enters the lungs, and it stimulates the vagus nerve. Right? So we've been talking a lot about this vagus nerve. So it stimulates the vagus nerve. And when we specifically breathe in through the nose and expand the belly, it activates the vagus nerve above the diaphragm. So it activates that ventral vagal complex. It helps to move back into that rest and digest, that social nervous system. It helps to bring us into greater calm, greater openness, greater receptivity. Now, it takes a little bit of time, but not that much. So in as little as 6 deep belly breaths, breathing in through the nose, and you can either breathe out the mouth or through the nose. Nice soft breath, so elongating the breath. So practice 3 more of those right now. Inhale through the nose. Slow, soft exhale out the mouth. 2 more. One more. Good. So in as little as 6 breaths, you will have effectively made a shift, even if it's 5 or 10% of that break, that vagal break. It will make a significant difference in your experience. So when you enter a state of stress, of anxiety, of overwhelm, of disconnect, of uncertainty, using the breath to access the nervous system is one of the fastest things that you can do to really shift your state, to shift your emotional state, to shift your physical state. And it really is that simple. You know, I've done a lot of work with the mind and spent a lot of time analyzing and trying to figure out, my life, the things that have bothered me, my limiting beliefs and habits and patterns with the mind. The difficulty with that is when I am in a stress state, so when I am activated in my nervous system, remember what we were talking about, that higher nervous system is offline. We don't have the same receptivity, we don't have the same cognition, memory retention, any of those things. And so it's actually really difficult to think our way out of a problem. It's really difficult to manage or navigate anxiety or any of these other experiences of stress by trying to think our way out of it. The power of breath is that it gives us direct access to the nervous system and helps us to use that vagal break to calm the stress response and that lower parasympathetic response, that dorsal vagal complex, if we go all the way there. And it will help us to come back into the social nervous system, so back into that space of receptivity, of openness, of rest and digest. Now, something that I'd like to note and explain a little bit about is that when we enter a state of freeze, when we enter a state of disassociation, which is really common with anxiety or PTSD, we activate that vagal break. Let's say we're starting to do some work and deal with some of the issues that have brought us into that space. What often ends up happening, because we're moving up the nervous system, that vagus nerve, is we enter first the sympathetic nervous system. So when we're dealing with some of these really deeply held experiences that have brought us into disassociation, we move first through that fight or flight response. So it can feel really activating. And if you are doing really powerful or strong breath work, sometimes you're taken in there really fast. And that's also why sometimes in talk therapy, we'll enter a space of activation before we move into a space of calm and receptivity. So just know that that's really normal and natural. And it's also really important to be gentle with ourselves, to have so much compassion for ourselves as we navigate some of these situations and experiences that have brought us into a space of disassociation or stress. And to also know that we can be more gentle even in terms of the practices that we use. So when I showed you the belly breath, that really is as easy as it can get. And sometimes when we start to feel the stress response, if that comes up for us, we can just ease back a bit. It doesn't have to be all of the really strong, powerful breathwork practices. And that's part of why I instructed you to use your nose, because the more that we breathe in through the nose, the more that we calm the nervous system, the more that we keep our bodies in that calm, receptive state, and the more that we help to bring oxygen to the brain and to the tissues. So slow, deep breathing in through the nose is really what's going to help to tone that vagus nerve, to really utilize the diaphragm to access our nervous system and move us into that more receptive state. Okay, so that is a pretty extensive, in-depth experience and exploration of this polyvagal theory. Now, it really is just scratching the surface. There is so much potential here with polyvagal theory, and I strongly encourage you to check out Dr. Stephen Porges and to follow his work. He has a book out which is incredible, and courses that you can also access. So lots of great resources for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with me in this exploration. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I do guide breathwork facilitator trainings and meditation teacher trainings that utilize this information and so much more to really help to support us in learning how to guide these essential practices that are so powerful for modulating our physical response or emotional response, and ultimately providing us with an experience of connection, of purpose, and fulfillment. So much love. Thank you for being here.